The air inside the Jefferson County Courthouse in Birmingham, Alabama felt thick, not from the heat outside, but from something heavier, an unspoken truth that had settled into the walls over decades. Everyone who walked through those heavy oak doors knew how things worked in Judge Meredith Langford's courtroom. She had been on the bench for 24 years, long enough to leave a legacy, but not the kind that earned plaques on the wall or celebrations in law schools. Hers was the kind whispered about in hallways, the kind discussed in hushed tones at bar association meetings. Attorneys, especially black attorneys, knew exactly what they were up against when their case landed in her courtroom. The rulings always seemed to lean one way. The objections she sustained or overruled followed a pattern. No one could prove it, but everyone understood. And today, that pattern was about to be tested. Darnell Hayes stepped into the courtroom, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. He had been here before, but today was different. Today, he wasn't just another defense attorney. Today, he had something she didn't see coming. Darnell was 48 years old, a man who had built his career on taking the cases no one wanted. His reputation stretched far beyond Alabama, a defense attorney ruthless in the courtroom, a man who could tear apart a prosecution's case piece by piece. And that made him a threat to people like Meredith Langford. But that never stopped him. What did stop him, just for a second, was the look in her eyes when he walked toward the defense table. She already hated him, not because of the case, not because of anything he had said, but because he was him. Darnell felt the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. This wasn't just about his client, Tyrone Wilkes, a man falsely accused of armed robbery. This wasn't just about proving one man's innocence. This was about something much bigger, and he wasn't leaving this courtroom without making that clear. Judge Meredith Langford barely looked up as she shuffled through paperwork. "Mr. Hayes," she muttered, adjusting her reading glasses, "you're already on thin ice in my courtroom. Don't waste my time today." There was no reason for her to say that. The trial hadn't even started. Darnell tightened his grip on his briefcase but kept his expression unreadable. "I'll try not to, Your Honor." Langford smirked. "Good, because I have a full docket and I don't need theatrics." She turned her gaze to the prosecution, an eager young assistant district attorney named Philip Calloway, fresh out of law school, trying too hard to impress the wrong people. "The state is ready, Your Honor," Calloway said, casting a smug glance in Darnell's direction. Of course they were ready. They were always ready when the case was stacked against a black man. Darnell's client, Tyrone Wilkes, sat beside him, hands folded, shoulders hunched forward, the kind of posture that belonged to someone who had been in the system too long, who had seen too much, who had lost too much. Darnell leaned in slightly. "We're ready too," he said, loud enough for the whole courtroom to hear. Langford exhaled through her nose. "Let's get this over with." The trial began, but it wasn't a trial. It was a performance, and Judge Langford had the starring role. Every objection Darnell raised, dismissed. Every time Calloway stumbled over a legal argument, she guided him like a teacher correcting a favorite student. The jury noticed. The gallery noticed. But no one was brave enough to say anything, except Darnell. He studied her, the way her lips curled when he spoke, the way she barely concealed her contempt. It wasn't just bias. It was something worse, something he had spent years preparing for. But the courtroom didn't know that yet. Langford wasn't even trying to hide it. Every time he spoke, she cut him off. Every time he raised a valid argument, she waved it away. Darnell caught the jury's discomfort in the way they shifted in their seats. Even some of the white jurors, who might have come in with their own biases, couldn't ignore what was happening. But Langford didn't care. She doubled down, her words sharper each time she addressed him. "Mr. Hayes, you're testing my patience. Mr. Hayes, if you raise one more baseless objection, I'll hold you in contempt. Mr. Hayes, this is not a lecture hall. If you want a grandstand, do it somewhere else." Darnell kept his expression calm. But inside his blood was boiling, not because she was insulting him. He could handle that, but because she was making it personal. And that was a mistake. Still, he needed her to keep talking, to keep exposing herself. "Your Honor," Darnell said, his voice measured, "the prosecution just introduced evidence that was not disclosed in discovery. That's a clear violation of Brady v. Maryland. I move for an immediate mistrial. Langford leaned back in her chair, adjusting her glasses with exaggerated boredom. Denied. Darnell blinked. Not out of surprise, out of strategy. He let the silence stretch, just long enough to make the jury shift uncomfortably. Then he spoke again. To be clear, Your Honor, you're refusing to acknowledge a Brady violation? Langford's lips pursed. I said denied, Mr. Hayes. Darnell could feel the courtroom shifting, the reporters scribbling faster, the whispers in the gallery growing louder. She saw it too. Her eyes darkened, and for the first time she looked directly at him. You are dangerously close to being held in contempt, Mr. Hayes. Darnell tilted his head slightly. For what, Your Honor? Asking the court to follow the law? Langford slammed her gavel so hard that the sound echoed against the high ceilings. That's enough, she snapped. One more word, and I'll have you removed. The room went dead silent. Darnell could hear his own heartbeat. But he wasn't nervous. This was exactly what he needed. Tyrone Wilkes clenched his fists under the table. Man, don't let her do this to you, he muttered. She's playing you. Darnell didn't even glance at him. I have nothing further, Your Honor. He sat down. Langford scoffed, acting as if she had won. But what she didn't realize was that the game had just begun. Darnell Hayes sat still, unmoving, unshaken. He had spent years preparing for this moment, watching the system twist itself in favor of people like Judge Meredith Langford. But today she had no idea she was playing directly into his hands. The jury wasn't laughing anymore. The gallery wasn't whispering about his outbursts. They were watching her, feeling the weight of every overruled objection, noticing how she was coaching the prosecution. The room was shifting, and she didn't even realize it. That was the thing about people in power for too long. They stopped pretending to be careful. And today, Darnell was going to use that arrogance against her. Philip Calloway, the young assistant district attorney, cleared his throat. The case had been smooth sailing for him until now. Judge Langford had been shielding him from every misstep, but now he wasn't so sure. He hesitated, flipping through his notes before forcing himself to push forward. Mr. Thomas, Calloway said, addressing the elderly store clerk on the witness stand, just to clarify, you are certain the defendant, Tyrone Wilkes, was the man you saw? The old man shifted in his seat, his eyes darting nervously. He wasn't sure. Darnell knew it. The jury knew it. Even Calloway knew it. But Langford wasn't about to let that stop her. Answer the question, Mr. Thomas, she pressed, her voice clipped. Darnell slowly stood up. Objection, Your Honor. Langford's head snapped toward him, her eyes burning with irritation. On what grounds? Darnell's voice remained steady. Coercion. The witness is hesitating, and rather than allowing him to answer naturally, the court is pressuring him. Langford scoffed, shaking her head. Overruled. Darnell didn't react. He expected that. He wanted that. Because this wasn't about winning an objection. It was about letting the court see her bury herself deeper. The trial continued, but it wasn't a legal battle anymore. It was a game of patience. Every time Darnell raised a legitimate argument, Langford crushed it. Every time he pointed out a contradiction in the evidence, she silenced him. The jury saw it. The gallery saw it. And most importantly, the reporters saw it. Darnell knew they were watching. He could feel their eyes on him, see the furious scribbling of pens against notebooks. This was no longer just a courtroom. It was a story unfolding in real time. And then, Langford made her biggest mistake. Your Honor, Darnell said, standing once again, I'd like to motion for an evidentiary hearing regarding newly surfaced documents that challenge the prosecution's case. Langford sighed, rubbing her temples. Mr. Hayes, this is the last time I'm going to entertain one of your stalling tactics. Darnell raised an eyebrow. Stalling tactics? Langford narrowed her eyes. I see what you're doing. Throwing out irrelevant motions, disrupting the court. If you continue down this path, I will hold you in contempt. Darnell didn't blink. Instead, he turned to the jury, locked eyes with them, held their gaze, let them feel the weight of what was happening. Then he calmly turned back to Langford. So, to be clear, Your Honor, you are refusing to allow evidence that could exonerate my client? Langford's lips curled in irritation. I am refusing to allow you to waste this court's time. Darnell nodded slowly. He turned to the court stenographer. Would you kindly read that last statement back? The room went dead silent. Langford's face twitched. She realized what he had just done. But it was too late. Langford's corruption had been an open secret for years. The way she denied motions against black defendants. The way she sustained objections for weak prosecutions. The way she shaped trials one ruling at a time, ensuring the outcome was exactly what she wanted. But today she had been caught in her own web, and Darnell was about to tighten the net. He reached into his briefcase, pulling out a thick folder of documents, her rulings, her patterns, her corruption, all laid out in black and white. But before he could make his next move, something happened that no one in the courtroom saw coming. The heavy double doors swung open, and the two men in suits stepped inside. At first, no one moved. The men were federal agents. You could see it in their posture, the way they walked with purpose. Langford finally noticed them, her brow furrowing. "Who are you?" she snapped, clearly irritated. One of the agents, a tall man with a sharp gaze, pulled a badge from his coat pocket. "Judge Meredith Langford?" he asked, his voice carrying through the entire courtroom. A ripple of unease spread through the gallery. Even the jury leaned forward. Langford straightened in her chair. "Yes." The agent took a step forward. "We need to speak with you immediately." Langford let out a breath of frustration. "I am in the middle of a trial." The agent didn't budge. "It's urgent." Darnell stayed perfectly still. He didn't need to say anything. Not yet, because he already knew what was coming. He had set this trap months ago, and Langford had just walked into it. The second agent stepped forward, and the words he spoke would send shockwaves through the room. "Judge Langford, we have a warrant for your arrest." For the first time in 24 years, Judge Meredith Langford lost control of her courtroom. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Reporters froze mid-sentence, their pens hovering above their notebooks. Even the jury sat motionless, eyes wide. Langford blinked, like she hadn't actually heard the words. "Excuse me?" she breathed. The lead agent reached into his coat, pulling out a folded sheet of paper. He read aloud, his voice steady. "Meredith Langford, you are being arrested under suspicion of bribery, abuse of power, obstruction of justice, and violation of civil rights under federal law." The room erupted. Whispers, gasps. The energy shifted so fast that even Calloway, the young prosecutor, looked like he was about to be sick. Langford's face paled. Her hands gripped the bench, knuckles turning white. She turned to Darnell, and in that moment, she finally understood. This wasn't just another case. This wasn't just a defense attorney making noise. This was the reckoning she never saw coming. Darnell stood up slowly, adjusted his tie. Then, without a hint of hesitation, he looked her in the eye. "I told you," he said, his voice even. "I follow the law, even when people like you don't." Langford's mask cracked, and as the agents snapped the cuffs around her wrists, the courtroom wasn't just watching anymore. They were witnessing history. For the first time in 24 years, Judge Meredith Langford was not in control of her courtroom. She had spent decades ruling from the bench with an iron grip, shaping the law to fit her own prejudices. She had silenced attorneys, destroyed lives, and ensured her own protection by aligning herself with powerful figures in the system. But today she was the defendant. The click of the handcuffs around her wrists echoed through the silent courtroom. Langford's hands trembled as she glanced toward the gallery. For the first time, she wasn't looking down at people. She was looking up at the jurors who had watched her railroading an innocent man, looking up at the attorneys she had demeaned for years, looking up at Darnell Hayes, the man who had set the trap and let her walk into it. "This is a mistake," she hissed, her voice low and sharp. The lead federal agent didn't flinch. "No, Judge Langford," he said, pulling her to her feet. "This is overdue." The gallery erupted into whispers. Reporters scrambled to take notes. Jurors sat frozen, their eyes bouncing from the scene unfolding before them to Darnell Hayes. Because this wasn't just a trial anymore. This was a reckoning, and Darnell had been waiting for it. He watched as Langford struggled to maintain even a shred of her dignity, her face a mask of disbelief and quiet rage. Darnell had studied men and women like her for years, those who had sat in power so long, that they believed themselves untouchable, until one day they weren't. Langford turned toward him, her lips curling in disgust. "You set me up." Darnell lifted an eyebrow. "No, Judge," he corrected smoothly, adjusting his tie. "You did this to yourself." Her breath hitched, her shoulders tensing against the grip of the agents. Darnell had been waiting for this moment. He had spent years collecting evidence, documenting her rulings, finding patterns, all of which pointed to one inescapable conclusion. Langford wasn't just biased. She was corrupt. Bribes, misconduct, deliberate manipulation of the law, and now it was all coming out. The lead agent turned toward the court, lifting the official arrest warrant. Judge Meredith Langford is being taken into federal custody, pending charges of judicial corruption, obstruction of justice, bribery, and multiple civil rights violations. A collective gasp rippled through the room. For years, Langford had acted as if she was untouchable. But the truth? She was just another cog in a broken machine. And today, that machine had finally jammed. Darnell turned toward the new judge, the one who had been rushed in to replace Langford, an older, respected black man named Judge Raymond Connors. His face was calm, his gaze thoughtful. He had watched everything unfold, and now, the weight of the moment settled on him. Darnell cleared his throat, stepping forward. "Your Honor, I move for an immediate dismissal of all charges against my client, Tyrone Wilkes." The courtroom held its breath. Even Philip Calloway, the young prosecutor who had once been so cocky, sat slumped in his chair, his face pale. He knew there was no way to salvage this case. Judge Connors nodded slowly. "Motion granted." The room exploded, not in cheers but in shock. A case that had been designed to railroad an innocent man, gone in seconds. The bailiff turned to Tyrone Wilkes, removing the handcuffs from his wrists. Tyrone rubbed his hands, staring at them like they weren't real, like he had expected them to stay bound forever. He turned to Darnell, his voice barely a whisper. I thought people like her never paid for what they did." Darnell's expression remained firm. "They do. Sometimes." Tyrone swallowed hard. Then, without a word, he walked out of the courtroom. Langford was led toward the exit, her face set in stone-cold rage. She passed Darnell, her gaze burning into him. He watched her with calm indifference, knowing this was just the beginning. Because Langford's arrest, it wasn't just about her. It was about the system she represented. The one that had been designed to silence people like Tyrone Wilkes. The one that had tried to silence people like Darnell Hayes. And now the fight wasn't over. Epilogue, the lesson. The case of Tyrone Wilkes versus the state of Alabama was over, but the impact? It had only just begun. Langford's arrest sent shockwaves through the legal community. Investigations into her past cases were launched. Dozens of wrongful convictions were re-examined. And Darnell Hayes? He wasn't stopping here. One corrupt judge falling didn't mean the system was fixed. But it was a start. A week later, Darnell stood on the courthouse steps, surrounded by reporters, their microphones pointed at him. "Mr. Hayes," one of them called, "did you always believe Langford would be arrested?" Darnell's lips curled into a faint smile. "I always believed justice would catch up to her," he said simply. Another reporter shouted over the crowd, "What's next for you?" Darnell adjusted his tie, looked directly into the camera, and without hesitation he said, "There are more Langfords out there, and I'm not done yet." Final thought. Why this matters. Judge Meredith Langford was one person, but the truth? There are many more just like her. People who think their power protects them, people who bend the law in their favor. And if this story makes you think, even for a second, share it, talk about it. Because the only way the system changes is if we make it. The courthouse in Jefferson County had been eerily quiet since Judge Meredith Langford's arrest. The press had moved on to other scandals, but the undercurrent of change was palpable, especially in the halls where Langford had once reigned with unmatched authority. Darnell Hayes had not rested on his laurels. The battle he fought in Langford's courtroom wasn't a victory for himself, it was for a larger cause. His mission had always been bigger than a single case. It was about shifting the balance of power, exposing the corruption, and fighting for those who had been crushed under the weight of a system built to favor the powerful. The legal community had taken notice, and word of his victory had spread far beyond Alabama's borders. It was a Thursday morning when Darnell was called into Judge Raymond Connor's chambers. Judge Connors, who had taken over Langford's cases, was a man known for his integrity. Connors had never been part of the old machine that Langford had built, but the system had still tested him. He was no stranger to the compromises and temptations that came with the power of the bench. But today he was facing something new, a shift that would affect more than just his court. As Darnell stepped inside, Connors looked up from the pile of case files he had been reviewing, his eyes tired but resolute. "Darnell," Connors said, gesturing for him to take a seat, "you've made a lot of people uncomfortable." Darnell smiled, but it wasn't a proud smile. It was a satisfied one. "I've made them wake up," he said, sitting down across from Connors. "It's the only way anything ever changes." Connors nodded. He was clearly a man who had seen the rot beneath the surface of the justice system, but even he had underestimated just how far that rot had spread. "You're right," Connors agreed. "But you've also exposed a lot of cracks, things that people aren't going to ignore anymore. Some of us are going to have to answer for it." Darnell's expression turned serious. He leaned forward, his voice quieter now. "That's the point, Judge. If we don't face the truth, if we don't answer for what's been done to people, then how can we ever fix the system?" Connor's gaze softened, and for the first time, Darnell saw a flicker of hope. Days passed, and Langford's arrest triggered a cascade of changes. Attorneys began to question their own complicity. Judges who had once followed Langford's example now found themselves under increased scrutiny. There was a sense of accountability in the air, one that had been absent for far too long. But the biggest change came when Darnell received a call from a national civil rights organization. They had been following his case, tracking the work he'd done, exposing Langford's actions. And they wanted to partner with him to start a nationwide initiative, a campaign aimed at holding corrupt judges accountable and bringing transparency to the judicial system. "It's time to take this fight national," the voice on the other end of the line said. "We need someone like you, someone who can show the system that we're not afraid anymore." Darnell didn't hesitate. "Let's do it." The trial of Tyrone Wilkes was dismissed, but its ripple effect continued to change the landscape of the American justice system. The federal investigations into Langford's past rulings opened doors to decades of miscarriages of justice, and the voices of the silenced, the innocent men and women, many of whom had languished in prison for years, began to be heard. Darnell's victory was not the end of his fight, it was just the beginning. In the months that followed, Darnell became a national figure, not just for his defense of Tyrone Wilkes, but for his relentless pursuit of justice, for his ability to stand in the face of a deeply flawed system and demand something better. Epilogue. The lesson. Darnell Hayes sat in his office late one evening, his feet kicked up on the desk. He glanced at the stack of case files in front of him, but didn't dive into them. He wasn't looking for the next big case. His focus had shifted. He had learned over the years that justice was not a destination. It was a journey, and it didn't come easily. There would always be more battles, more corruption to uncover, more injustice to fight. But what Darnell had done, what he had helped expose, was something that couldn't be undone. Langford's arrest wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. And the lesson he had learned, the one he now shared with every young attorney, every activist, and every person who was tired of being silenced, was simple. The system will only change if we refuse to accept it the way it is. Darnell looked out the window as the sun dipped behind the skyline, its final rays casting a golden glow across the city. There would be more cases, more battles to fight, but now for the first time, he felt the weight of the work he had done and the promise of what was to come. Change, he thought, is the hardest thing to make, but it starts with us. And as long as people like Darnell Hayes were willing to stand up and fight, change was inevitable. The end lesson. True change comes from standing up against the system, even when it feels like you're facing insurmountable odds. Justice doesn't just happen. It's made by those willing to question, expose, and fight for what is right.